En el centro de la pampa vive un pimiento, sol y viento pa' su vida, sol y viento, sol y viento pa' su vida, sol y viento.
These Pimento notes that I've recorded in the autumn of 2014 are snatches of different kinds of places. London streets, a small village cemetery in England, a large deserted beach in Sicily where the ancient Greeks once came, the fortress of the Nuragic people in Sardinia. These are all places that I've visited, making these notes this autumn. Of course, images can't tell anything really about the deeper reality of events that's occurring right now in Europe and in Italy and Sicily and Sardinia. Lava flow and ash, 12 noon on the sides of Mount Etna.
Fall of 2002-2003, this place was totally flat, without trees.
Here you see one of the guides on Mount Etna speaking to visitors at about 10,000 feet. He's talking about the eruptions of 2002-2003 and how they created a new crater system at the very top, 200 meters high and 800 meters in circumference, destroying the cable car and the facilities that once were there on that flat space.
Here is gas continuing to come from the source of an eruption more than 10 years ago, but it's the most recent big eruption here.
Mount Etna was the center point of a 6-week trip that Marilyn Gillis and I undertook in September-October 2014. We were meeting our friend Aldo Vesnever to visit Sardinia and Sicily. And somehow the force of the volcano and its cooled lava flows seemed to serve as a metaphor for the forces moving underneath European and Western society in this 100th year after the start of World War I. Etna has destroyed objects and people, but its rich volcanic soil at lower altitudes produces rich wine and succulent honey. Etna takes away, but it also giveth. Aldo, Marilyn, and I were drawn to the mountain. Aldo had just visited his family in Trieste at the end of September. I had found my father's grave in England before coming to Sicily, and Marilyn and I were eventually going, after Etna, to visit the final place in Hilversum, the Netherlands, of our friend Henk Jong, a brave member of the Dutch resistance during the Nazi occupation in World War II. Since Marilyn and I lived in Holland 25 years ago when I worked at Radio Netherlands, we went back in 2014 to renew old contacts. The lava of Etna is one of the deep millennial forces of nature. Its equivalent in human society, you might say, is what historians call la longue durée, patterns that extend over long stretches of time. These October notes, 2014, that I've made into 3 separate Pimento reports are somewhat unusual for videos. They come in 3 parts. Parts 2 and 3 are about Sardinia and Sicily. Part 1 is about Etna first, and then London and Britain, where Marilyn and I were in September 2014. When we were in London, Marilyn and I stayed in the Lewisham-Ladywell part of metropolitan London on the south bank of the Thames River. Over several days, we made a loop over the Thames into central London, then around to Sloane Square and what's known as the West End, south to the Tate Britain Museum on the Embankment, and then back where we started at Southwark to see a Shakespeare comedy, The Comedy of Errors, at the reconstructed Globe Theatre. In the middle of this London loop, we went to the Hampshire countryside, about 50 miles away, to look for my father's grave. But our point of origin in all of this was Southwark Cathedral on the south bank of the Thames.
Southwark Cathedral, on the south bank of the Thames River, very near where Geoffrey Chaucer had his pilgrims start off on their road to Canterbury. Here we have this new structure right next to Southwark Cathedral, actually. It's a needle in the sky. There's St. Paul's, and moving to the right, new structures. So here we are on the old 11 bus, going right into the heart of London, just passing Whitefriars Street now, EC4. We're on the 11, just approaching Chancery Lane, up here on the right-hand side. Here we are off Sloane Square. This is the very wealthy part of London, which has attracted wealthy people from all over the world. A lot of hot money. This is the Rose and Crown pub, not very far from Sloane Square. I remember being in here in 1977 with my mother, who had a friend who lived over this pub during World War II. And in the pub I met a Londoner from this area of London, a Cockney, you might say, a man who was a plumber. And I said, you know, it's about 1977, really Britain would do best to become a Scandinavian country and have higher taxes and better services. And he said, well, he was complaining terribly about his taxes. And I said, well, why not be like the Danes or the Swedes? And I said, they pay even higher taxes than you do. And he said, yeah, but they get something for their money. He was the kind of person who would have voted very soon afterwards for Margaret Thatcher. So Britain has not become Scandinavian. Certainly England hasn't. And the London we see today is a result of all of that, full of very wealthy people, and poor people have to manage as best they can. Carlisle Mansions in the West End, not far from Victoria Station. We're going up to the top where it says AD 1886. So when these apartments were built, London was arguably the richest city in the world. Before, of course, the First World War. We're going to London's Victoria Station. This is the station in about 1917 when my Aunt Alma rescued her brother, really. He had been in the First World War. He enlisted when he was 16 in Sydney, Australia. And his sister got him out of the army because he seemed to be suffering from trauma, as far as I can gather. And he arrived here at this station completely covered in mud. She didn't recognize him. He was completely covered in mud from head to toe.
London 2014 is in the middle of a housing crisis. The average rent is £1,200 a month, that's about 1,700 Canadian dollars, and quite often people spend 60% of their income on rent. A recent Fabian Society pamphlet, Our London, points to 2.5 million people unemployed in the metropolitan region and 1.5 million underemployed. 3/4 of new homes are sold abroad, and 400,000 children live in overcrowded housing. Sadiq Khan, the Labour shadow minister for London, edited that pamphlet, and he writes of thousands of people living in sheds with no windows, sanitation, or running water. Khan says that London is now one of the most unequal cities in the developed world. But London is one of the richer regions of Great Britain. Little wonder, then, that the charity Oxfam issued an emergency press release in March 2014. They called that release A Tale of Two Britons, warning that, like London, Britain is deeply divided, with 1 in 5 people below the poverty line. Here is the paradox. Britain has one of the highest growth rates right now in Europe, and a relatively low unemployment rate. But this economic activity depends on a rising number of people in insecure jobs that do not pay enough to make ends meet.
These are the steps to the Tate, as it was always known. Now it's called Tate Britain, to distinguish it from the Tate Modern. And it was in front of this very elegant building that a man called Luke, 58 years old, from Ireland, gave me his diagnosis of the state of Britain.
Like that plumber of a long, long time ago, Luke had some surprisingly conservative ideas. I asked him about the situation that he was in, and he tended to blame his situation and other things on two groups, people who were British or English, who were entitled because of the welfare state, and also immigrants to the country. Inside the Tate Britain Museum is a good place to think about London. The clash of the old and the new, the fixed and the broken. Phillida Barlow's installation sculpture, called just simply Dock, intentionally plays on the contradiction between her construction and the neoclassical Duveen galleries of the museum in which the sculpture is set and against which it rises.
Henry Moore, 1951, reclining figure, plaster form.
The Tate Britain Museum makes you think of empire and power, as in J.M.W. Turner's harrowing picture Hannibal Crossing the Alps, or Turner's perspective of St. Paul's Cathedral, seen from Greenwich many years ago, and that very same cathedral seen in the London of today, the past merging with the present. Just below the steps of the Tate Britain Museum is the Thames River and its embankment.
Edge of the embankment, a lot of traffic. Again, the old and the new. Here we are looking towards the south bank of the Thames, and there's these new buildings. Frankly, it looks grotesque. The grotesque, the ugly, and the massive.
Marilyn and I soaked up London. But my main personal individual reason for the visit, which Marilyn happily went along with, was to go to rural England, to the countryside outside of London, to find my father's grave. This was somewhat strange, since I was the one who in 1961, when I was 18, arranged to have my dead father taken back from New York City to be buried in rural England. And I knew the area around a place called Hartley Wintney in Hampshire, because I lived there when I was a little child, and I'd also visited the churchyard where he was buried in 1966. But now, in 2014, I could not recall precisely which small village around Hartley Wintney held my father's grave. All I had to go on was a picture taken by a photographer in a place called Fleet in Hampshire. But when Marilyn and I went to Hartley Wintney, two people in a realty company on the high street there, Carly Eaton and Gary MacDonald, really helped me. Carly looked at the photo, used her computer in her office, and then suddenly announced, "I found it. It's Mattingley Parish Church." Marilyn and I then took a local taxi, driven by a Sikh gentleman, and found the village graveyard in Mattingley.
I've come with Marilyn. There she is, taking photos in the distance. So what's your reaction to this?
It would be a beautiful place to be buried. It's a lovely, lovely old church in peaceful surroundings. Very nice place.
Now, I decided at the age of 18, short of my 19th birthday, that Dudley, who had always loved England, wasn't very at home in New York City, that he should be brought home to be buried. Do you think that was the right decision?
I would say definitely this is a perfect spot for someone who loves England. It seems very English too in here.
It does.
Very nice.
It does seem very
Even
English.
the church is just, I wonder how old the church is.
Yeah, we'll go and look
It's
at the
beautiful.
church,
We'll
yeah.
Look at that, yeah.
Marilyn and I went inside Mattingly Parish Church. We met a very friendly member of the church who has himself become a prelate. He told us, reminded us, that the very center and inside of the church dates from 1387. We really enjoyed being there. I told myself that I would come back and take care of my father's gravestone, but not right away. Then Marilyn and I went back to London, and we said goodbye to the city by going once again to Southwark, to the Globe Theatre, to see Comedy of Errors. Our stay in England was friendly and good, and in a way the motto of what we were all doing could be taken from the end of Comedy of Errors, when one of the twins, Dromio of Ephesus, says, "We came into the world like brother and brother, and now let's go hand in hand, not one before another,